Take it away, Tom and Daniel.
Thanks, Wendy, and thank you, Daniel, for agreeing to do this film festival online. I wanted to ask you before we start talking about your movie, which I loved, how this pandemic has been affecting you personally as well as professionally.
Like everyone, and I think it's a cause for anxiety and stress, but ultimately I have a lot to be grateful for. And thankfully my family and loved ones are all fine. And you know, for me, it's just really annoying to be cooped up. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of people whose fates are far more tragic and are going through things that are far more challenging. And so it's those people that I'm thinking about. Professionally, films aren't really being made now. You can't shoot a film.
Yeah. Have you done a lot of these online film festivals?
So I have a couple film. No, I have not. This is the first one. And a lot of films are in post-production. So I'm finishing a film now, a short film. But other than that, just developing and waiting for this to end, like a lot of other people, and staying busy and taking French lessons.
Well, that's good. Can you give our audience a little sense of your background in terms of filmmaking before you made this documentary?
Sure. Well, I guess my background in filmmaking really goes back to when I was very, very young, and I've always been interested in creative things, at drawing and painting and things like this. And I went to college for a year in Savannah, Georgia, to an art school there. But then I decided that I wasn't really interested academically or intellectually, so I dropped out and just started making documentaries. And I would travel to places around the world that were of interest to me, and I would just make films while I was there. And I did a bunch of those sort of early rough and tumble films. And slowly I was able to sort of hone my craft and turn myself into a better filmmaker. And then this opportunity came around to work with Robbie Robertson on his documentary. And that obviously was an exciting opportunity that was that took my career to the next level.
Now, I understand that before you got involved with this movie, you were already a big fan of the band. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Canada, and we worship our own up here. And 4 of the 5 guys of that group are Canadian. And even though they're credited with being one of the foundational groups of Americana music, you know, like Robbie, I always like to remind people that it's North Americana, because Richard, Garth, Rick, and Robbie were all from Southern Ontario, and they all got plucked up by Ronnie Hawkins. So I've always been a big fan. Their music was definitely in the soundtrack to my life. And I think it was that passion for their music that really empowered me through this experience.
I'm sure a lot of people would love to hear how you convinced Robbie Robertson to allow you to direct this documentary. He was involved from the beginning.
Yeah.
And even though you had a lot of success doing what you were doing before this film, he really could pick anyone he wanted to make this movie. It's a pretty big deal that he chose you. How did you convince him?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think that any filmmaker would have, leapt at the opportunity to work on this film. But what I brought to the table that I think he really appreciated was the sensibility and this passion. And what I explained to him the first time we met was, I'll die before your movie's not amazing. I'll do everything I can. I'll work as hard as I possibly can. I will not sleep until your film is as good as it can be. And if it's anything less than that, I won't be done. And I think that spirit and energy really resonated with him, because he remembered being a young man trying to make his mark on the world. And so he saw something in me. And I later learned that he saw a version of his younger self in me. And that was obviously quite inspiring. And what he was speaking to was the ambition and passion and energy that perhaps an older filmmaker who's had more credits and more success might not have had the bandwidth to give the project.
Daniel, once you got the okay to make the movie, what was your first step in the process of making this film?
Well, the research was very intense. I mean, Robbie's life is really an encyclopedia of the history of popular music in America. And so there was a lot of research involved, and it was really just planning what the film would be. Robbie's book was the spiritual guide that we relied on for the film, and so it was devouring that. It quickly became my Bible, and just really understanding and pinpointing what the most important critical moments of the film would be, and how to tell all these stories, and then starting with the monumental task of archival research.
For anyone that has seen the film, there's a lot of big names in this movie. You worked with all of them. Who gave you the most information, though, would you say, that was a real surprise and gave you what you needed to make this film?
Well, when I interviewed Eric Clapton, I didn't expect that he would be so candid and forthright about the drug addiction, the alcoholism, the struggles with sobriety, that he remembered some members of the band experiencing, that he of course experienced himself. These are very sensitive, personal, deeply personal, challenging things, and that was something that was really unique. He was very, very candid in that regard, and spoke with an expert knowledge on the disease that is alcoholism and addiction. And that was something I was really grateful for. Every time you do an interview, it's a bit of a crapshoot. You don't know what you're going to get. And I was really generous that he was so open and, so open and honest.
Daniel, a lot of times when a famous person will hire someone either as a director for their documentary or as a co-writer on a book, one might hesitate a little bit out of fear that they won't be able to do the film that they want to, because the person that they're making the film about is right there, that they're involved in the project. Did you have any concerns like that at all working with Robbie Robertson?
No, because, so much I think of these rock and roll stories, the way that the artists themselves communicate them and tell their own stories is largely myth making. And I think, a good documentarian or storyteller will be able to sort of see through that veneer of myth making and get to the emotionality and human truth that underlines all of that. And in regards to working with Robbie, I wasn't too worried about him being involved, because he really wasn't. I mean, for 12 months, we were just doing our work, and then we would show him a rough cut, and he was like, "This is really great." But I had a very clear sense of what I wanted the film to be, and he was really, really respectful and good at just letting me do my thing and giving us, the creatives, the space and time to make something really great.
When you say that you had a really good vision of what you wanted the film to be, I know the starting point was the book, but what did you bring to the vision in terms of making it into a movie?
Well, it was really about the film's, to me, not so much about a rock band or a rock star or this songwriter. And it's really about these five guys and the fragility and impossibility of being in a band. Like, what an impossible, bizarre relationship. I grew up like making movies and drawing comic books, so I was never in a band, so I don't really know. But one thing I learned making this film is just how impossible and bizarre that relationship is. You're married to these five guys that were your best friends since you were 17 years old, and every endeavor in your life has to be done together. Well, the reality is people grow up, they change, they're interested in this, or they're not so interested in that, and people get married, and then all of a sudden his wife's coming along, and maybe you don't get along with her as well as that other guy's wife, and it becomes challenging. And it's just life, and it's just the difficulty of human interaction. And that's really what the movie was about for me, that sort of fragility and brotherhood. And ultimately, what I want people to carry forward and take away from this movie is that the interpersonal struggles and impossibilities and challenges in the eyes of history and time don't matter, because like any great marriage, what is left were the children that were produced from it. And in this case, it's a body of extraordinary music.
When one looks back at their body of work, what is it that you feel after studying it for so long, making this movie, is so impressive that will make their mark in history, in music history, stand for a long time?
Well, when the band's first record came out, you know, it just turned heads. It was like nothing anyone had ever heard before. You know, to quote Bruce Springsteen, he really articulated it well. He said, you know, it's not like anything we'd ever heard before, but it had always been there. And I think it's that magical, intangible quality, a timelessness, but at the same time, it sounds completely new. And it's hard to articulate exactly what that is, but when you hear it, you feel it and you know it. And I think it's that intangible, magical quality that will inspire and live on as long as people are listening to music, and as long as there's a society. That band and their musical contributions will continue to exist, because there's just so much soul in the music. There's so much heart. And, you know, when five guys of great talent are able to come together and create something so, it just has longevity. And that's something that I think is really unique.
One of the exciting things about this movie is that you also had the opportunity to work with Martin Scorsese. He's one of the producers on the film. And of course, he famously directed The Last Waltz, but he's also done many landmark music documentaries. It must have been a little bit intimidating, although you don't seem like the type of person to get intimidated. But what kind of support did he actually offer when making this film? And what did you learn from someone who's had so much experience making music documentaries?
Well, what type of support did he offer? He, you know, is obviously someone who's very passionate about the band and their legacy, and passionate about music in general. So I think it was just embedding the production and sharing that passion with us and reminding us why we're doing this. He was really generous to look at cuts and give us notes. It's kind of an incredible thing when Martin Scorsese looks at your rough cut and gives you notes on it. You know, he was just a really, someone like that just brings a wealth of experience, and, you know, you really just pay attention and cling to every word, and it forces you to do your best and up your game, because you don't want to show something bad to a guy like that.
I can't imagine the pressure. We learn a lot about Robbie Robertson in this film, obviously, and you do a fantastic job telling his story. We learn about his work ethic. We learn about his love of family. We learn about his passion for music. I was wondering, though, in the time that you spent making this movie and getting to know him a little bit better, what do you feel is his key to success?
Robbie is a perfectionist, and he's ambitious. If it's not as good as it can possibly be, why does it exist? And that's the pedigree that he brings to everything he does. And I think for his collaborators, often that level of perfectionism can be annoying or difficult, but that's why he is who he is. Also, what's unique about Robbie is that he's highly ambitious. He always has been since he was 15 years old. And he works incredibly hard, and he pays attention to what's going on around him. And he's just a really, really smart, focused guy. And so that's why I think he and I were in sync. I sort of am a perfectionist with my work. And, you know, I would have done anything to make this film as good as I possibly could have. When we didn't have money for an editor, well, I learned to edit and started cutting the film. You know, it's like whatever we had to do to finish the movie, I would have done. And that's the spirit that I think Robbie has with his own work.
So you learned how to edit to make this movie. That's amazing. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I knew I've edited a little bit before, but certainly not at a professional level like this. But, you know, it's like, it was a necessity. We had to finish the film, and I had my own ideas that I don't think were being communicated. And so I just, you know, rolled up my sleeves and started cutting and started producing scenes that really felt right. I saw them in my head and I felt them. I felt them when I closed my eyes and watched the movie play before it was edited. And then it was just a question of, okay, making it happen and implementing. So Yeah, it is what it is, but you got to do whatever I could have done to make the film.
Sometimes when one has that experience of having total control, it's hard to give it up the next time they make a movie. Is this something that you would want to do again? Shoot it and edit it, the whole deal?
Well, I just think the way, you know, documentary specifically is such like a pain in the ass, unforgiving, horrible, terrible medium. It's like a horrible job. It's a horrible career. It just sucks. But it's the only thing I know how to do. It's the only thing I want to do. And it's just like this unhealthy, toxic relationship. And I'm just obsessed with it. And I don't know what else I can do. And in order to make a film, because it's such a horrible process of getting things financed and this and that, you have to be 200% passionate about the material. I could not make a film if I was not prepared to live in that world every single day for 2 or 3 years for very little pay, you know, with no guarantee that there will be any payoff at the end. When I was sitting in the edit room in a little suite in downtown Toronto on a cold February morning at 7:30 in the morning when I get to work, you know, you don't know that this film is going to open TIFF or go on to be seen all over the world. You hope that's what you aspire to, but you don't know. And so the only way you can emotionally get through the challenge that is making the thing, and I think this goes for writing a novel or creating an album. Anytime you're creating something, it's just like, you got to love it. Like when I'm feeling depressed and I don't want to make this movie anymore, I'll just put on, you know, the Brown album or Music for Big Pink and be like, oh yeah, this is why I'm doing this, because I love this music so much and it means a great deal to me to be able to share where it comes from. And I think that's something I just want to add, that has been specifically highlighted in the last few weeks. You know, I spent a lot of time on film festival panels and circuits with this movie, sitting across from filmmakers, men and women, who have made extraordinary films, very important films, human rights films, in hospitals in Syria and in Iceland and all over the place, telling very important stories. And it made me sort of think like, oh, well, I just made a little rock and roll movie. Who cares? And in the last 3 or 4 weeks, since we've been in this new COVID world, what has really come into focus is this reality of like, oh, my film is providing people with 2 hours of much needed musical respite from what's going on around them. And people have been writing to me and expressing their gratitude for that. And it's forced me to reframe this thing that I made in my own head and realize that, oh, this is a contribution that actually matters. And that's been something that's been very particularly rewarding for me.
That's fantastic. Just to go back to what you originally said, I mean, you gave a little bit of an explanation, but I think a lot of people would be shocked to hear your description of being a documentary filmmaker as being so terrible.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were just exaggerating, but for those people that maybe falsely believe it's so glamorous.
It's you know, the analogy I think of when I think of making documentaries is that I once got so anxious and had a panic attack before I was working on this movie. It was so horrible that I very impromptu took a bicycle trip. I rode a bike across Cuba, just as like a getaway, unplug, think about something else. And when you're riding a bike across Cuba, you know, there are moments when you are just riding up hills that are horrible. No one told me before I did this that Cuba's got a lot of hills in the middle of the country. And so you're spending 2 hours just struggling and your legs are killing you and it's absolutely just shit and it's terrible. And you're just pedaling one pedal after another. And after like 2 hours, you get to the top and then you start to roll down. And for like 4 minutes, you're just like, you know, your hair's blown in the wind and everything's whizzing by and you're the king of the world and it feels great. And I think that metaphor is just making stuff, whether it's any type of art, film, music, writing a book. That's what it is. One of my good, really dear friends and mentors is the beloved novelist John Irving. And, you know, John, he lives here in Toronto, and he wrote to me the other day, and he's staying in his apartment. He's obviously on quarantine lockdown, and he's every day going on his treadmill and hiking it up to the incline, the tallest level, and just walking up, you know, walking up a hill, walking up the hill, walking up the hill. And he does that for half an hour, and he describes it. He's like, oh yeah, it's like finishing a novel. And I think that's just like any art. It's just like, that's what you're doing. You're just schlepping up a mountain until you get to the top, and then you get to feel good for 5 minutes. And it feels amazing. And you're like, I wish I could just bottle this up and take a little sip of this, you know, when I'm anxious again in a month. And that's just the process. So I love it and I hate it, and I couldn't do anything else, but I think about doing something else all the time because it's horrible, but it's also the greatest thing in the world.
Well, Danny, you alluded to before that you learned in making this film that you're a lot like Robbie Robertson. And one of the characteristics you mentioned is that he's ambitious, you're ambitious. What are your ambitions moving forward?
Well, I just want to have a net positive impact on the world. One thing a perspective I gained from making this film, being a young man, sort of on the cusp of starting my career, making a film about an older man who was at the end of his remarkable career, is that I forced to frame my life in a new way. Normally, I just saw my life or thought of my life in a year, or what am I going to be doing in a year or 5 years? But now I have this fortitude that I didn't have before. I was like, oh, one day I'm going to be 78. That's a long time. I have a lot of years to do a lot of different things. And ultimately, I just decided that I wanted my vision and path to be guided by this vision of just doing things that I think are good for the world, that make me feel fulfilled, and leaving a legacy of some tangible things behind. I really love making films. I love making documentaries. It's a really difficult thing to do. I'm very politically engaged. I love public service and community service and public policy. I love visual arts, painting and drawing and photography. And I want to somehow balance all of these things that I'm very passionate about all together, so I can also have a family and you know, buy a house one day and be okay financially. And so those are sort of the great challenges of my life. But in short, I just want to make stuff that I'm inspired by, that gets me out of bed every morning and gives my life purpose. And I know that sounds like really grand, but you know, I think that's just a perspective that I have after making a film like this.
Well, the film teaches that it is important to think in those terms. After having shown this film all over the world, what would you say is the number one thing that you're hearing from audiences? And we can wrap this up with this question.
You know, I think I appreciate when people tell me things like, your film brought me back to this time and place when I was 16 years old or 14 years old, and I bought this record and it changed my life. And I remember that summer, or I remember when that happened. And I remember driving across the country and listening to that record or whatever it is. And I think that if you can make a piece of art that connects with someone on that level, make a film that transports someone back to a time in their life that really means a lot to them, and makes them access and engage those feelings of, I guess, nostalgia. I think that's a really beautiful thing, and that's a contribution that I'm very happy to have made. And I think people get a real kick out of the fact that, you know, this film is my vision. It's my film, and you know, I wasn't around for the band. They had been broken up for many years before I was even born. And what that speaks to is like the timelessness, the generational defining, or rather the generational obscuring barriers that this music has. I mean, it'll be listened to forever. I'll listen to it. My kids will listen to it. And that's something that's really special. And I think that's something that I really appreciate out of this process.
Well, I want to congratulate you. You did a fantastic job making this movie.
Thank you very much.
And you are so wise for someone your age. And
oh, thank you.
I think you were exactly the right person to, bring Robbie's book to life. And I look forward to seeing what you do next. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you all for your interest, and thank you, Tom, for facilitating this. And I just hope everyone who is watching this enjoyed the film, and I do hope that it provided them with that musical relief for just a little while.
All right. Thanks, Daniel. And back to you, Wendy.
I would like to thank you for the wonderful, wonderful Q&A. We learned so much, Daniel. Thank you for taking time from Canada to join us to just make your wonderful film even more special and more poignant. I wish everybody safe, to be safe and sound.